I'm in my orchestrator instance, and one of the things that you have to know before diving into the UiPath service router application is the name of the UI Bank multi-service application, right? As you can see from my orchestrator instance, the banking application that we reviewed in the previous section has already been deployed to the orchestrator, and the name of the process is UI Bank multi-service application. And the name of the package is demo_UI Bank_banking_app. Now you have to have these two pieces of information because the service router application will need to know how to route the request to the banking application, right? And therefore, please note these after you deploy your banking application to the orchestrator, because we'll be needing it when we are building our service router application. I'm in Studio, and here is the project for the integration service router, or simply the service router automation. As discussed before, this is a background process that has no user interface elements in it. And this is something that you have to take note of. The first thing that you would want to configure in this application is the config file, and it is under the config folder of the project. Now, here is the README version. I have put this in here so that you can go through the documentation before you generate the actual process config file. Now, for the simplicity of this demonstration, we have put in a very simple configuration file, but in a practical application, this would obviously be a configuration database or some kind of a repository where your integration service router is able to look up information about your customers and validate it before routing the request to the banking application, right? So let's look at the process config README. Obviously, you have to remove all of these pieces of documentation when you implement your file. The other thing to note is for the scope of this demonstration, the settings have to be listed in the order that have been indicated here, right? So the first element that you need to put in here is your trusted sender email address, basically your customer email address. The second is the process name of your multi-service banking application. We just discussed that. This is the name of the process as visible in the orchestrator and or the assistant. So if I go to the assistant, you can see that the UI Bank multi-service application process is available to me, and it is visible in the assistant. The third line is the name of the package, right? It's obviously, we saw this in the just a short while ago, and you got to put in the name of the package here, and it is the same as seen in the orchestrator. The next would be, now this is going to differ based on the services exposed by your banking application, but I have put them in a specific order. The first one is main, which is basically an entry point that returns helpful information on the services available, or made available by the banking application. And the second is the money transfer XAML endpoint, which is the second entry point, and then the account balances service XAML. Notice that the XAML extensions have not been specified here. That is because the router is going to append those at runtime when routing or invoking these endpoints of the banking application. So what happens is that with these entries specified in this order that is shown here, when the service router loads the process configuration file into an array of strings, this is how we will be referring to these pieces of information, right? For example, if the service router has to call money transfer service.xaml, it is going to refer to the array, the configuration settings array with this reference, config settings of 4, right? Which means this is an entry on line 5. So you get the idea, right? Basically, what we have done is instead of calling the names of these services directly or these artifacts directly, we have referred to them in the array as array elements. Now, although it is inconvenient, it can be a bit flexible because tomorrow you can decide to change the name of your application. The package name may change, right? And you might offer the same services, but the endpoint of or the names of the endpoints can be different, right? And therefore, this offers some kind of flexibility when you want to kind of make some changes to your services and also to your banking application. If you remove all of the comments and remove all of the descriptions here, your config text file must look as simple as this, right? Of course, I've obscured my email address. Everything else is as you see. And your process config file must look something like this. But again, remember, please put in a valid email address here. So this is the first thing that the service router application is going to do. It is going to load the process configuration settings. The next file that we are going to look at is the main.xaml. And again, this service router, integration service router, as its name suggests, interfaces directly with the UiPath Integration Service trigger. And therefore, it receives all these standard inputs that you see here as part of the arguments. Now, this is something to note again. Remember, when you built the banking application did not have any idea about these parameters, right? And therefore, the integration service router is going to perform that translation between the information received from the trigger and then translate that correctly and then route it towards the banking application. There are a couple of other subflows here. We have already covered the respond to sender. This is pretty much the same as what was covered in the banking application. Basically, it gives the service router the ability to respond back to the customer over an integration service connection. That is because it is possible that when the customer sends in a request via email, you might want to respond back saying, hey, we have received your request and it is under progress. Now that's up to you to implement, but in this case, I have not implemented that. What happens in this application is the service router receives the protocol, it passes the instruction to the banking application, and once the banking application has successfully completed, or if it has failed for some reason, then it takes the result and then responds back to the customer. Now let's take a look at the email router flow and see what it does. So as mentioned before, the first thing that this email router.xaml does is it loads the configuration setting file. And if I double click on this, you can see that it calls a subflow within the router process subfolder. So again, being consistent with the design pattern, the main flows are on the outside, but the subflows are within two subfolders. One is the router process. This has got to do with all the processes that are connected to the routing functionality of this automation, right? And here is the response process, which is under the response process folder, right? Now, there are many number of subflows here, and they perform specific functions based on the service that is required. So the first thing that it does is load process settings, and what is returned is actually a configuration array of strings, right? That's all it does. It's very simple, and you can explore this flow by yourself. So once the configuration settings are loaded, the next thing that this flow does is to parse the email instructions received over the integration service trigger. Basically, the information that is received through these 4 standard integration service input arguments, right? So once it does that, right, it basically calls this flow, parse email instructions. Once it has got that information in the email, it moves on to validate or check what protocol has been received, right? So if I go back to the route process, it starts to check for the protocols that it has received, right? Now, I have laid out the protocols to check in the reducing complexity of each of these protocols. Like I said in the review of or the walkthrough of the banking application, the money transfer is the most complex, followed by the check account balances, followed by get help information, right? So it goes in the order of decreasing complexity. And first it tries to check for the protocol to see whether the protocol received is basically a money transfer protocol. Now, if it is a money transfer protocol, the flow goes to the left, and then it calls out to the flow validate money transfer protocol. Now, remember, there is a difference between validating business logic and validating protocol. What I mean to say by that is this protocol that you see here might be correct. It says transfer money from checking to savings in the amount of $48. Now, this might be correct, but it might still fail business logic because there might be no account balance in the checking account to make that transfer, right? So what I'm trying to get at here is the email or the integration service router validates the protocol for correctness. It does not check the business rule. That is the job of the banking application, right? Now it validates the money transfer protocol. Again, for any of these protocol validations, please watch the previous videos, right? So this time it calls this flow, and once that flow has successfully validated the protocol, it now invokes the endpoint of the banking application, right? And here is an invoke process activity. So if I double click on it, so here is the invoke process activity. The first thing that we are going to specify is either a process name or a package name, right? Remember that when you are calling an endpoint in a multi-service application, if the endpoint is not main, right, main.xaml, you call out the package. You don't call the process, right? So in the process name column or the field, you have to specify the package name. Now here it says that the value of that package is in array position 3, right? And if I go back to the process config, array position 3 is here, demo UiPath banking app. This is the name of the package, right? So you specify the name of the package, and then you pass it the email message ID. Obviously, the message ID is the event object ID. And then you pass it the email instructions, right? Remember, the email instructions were received and parsed out, and then it was validated for protocol correctness. That is the email instruction that you are passing in to this endpoint. Coming down, if you expand on the advanced options, here is the entry point path. Like I said, again, you have to refer to the config settings, and here it says the entry point name is on in array location 4 or line 5 of the configuration file. So if I go in here, on line 5 is money transfer service. And as I had mentioned before, the .xaml extension is appended at runtime, right? So this is what it takes for us to invoke an endpoint in a multi-service UiPath automation. Now, one of the things that you have to observe with the 2022.10 release is that after I upgraded after the UiPath stable release was updated to version 2020.10, the use package flag that is part of the invoke process activity has disappeared. I do not know where it is. I have looked for it everywhere. I cannot find it. But if you do find it, make sure that you set the use package flag to true, right? This is only for endpoints that you call that are not main.xaml endpoints, right? So remember that. Similarly, if we go back to the email route process, if the money transfer is not the protocol or the service that is required, it checks to see whether it is a balance inquiry service. And if that is so, likewise, it validates that protocol to see if that protocol is correct. And if it is correct, it invokes the balances process, right? So double clicking on this. Here again, you can see the invoke process activity. And in this case, it's almost everything is the same except this part here, where it says config settings of 5, which is line 6. And on line 6 is the account balances service, right? So that is the fundamental difference between the previous invoke process and this one. And if you look at the message ID and the instructions, please note they may look the same, but they are not the same because the instructions that are received depend on the protocol and the validation of that protocol, right? In other words, that instruction is output by this previous step here, the step that validates a particular protocol, right? So now that you have seen how the two endpoints, the extended endpoints are called, let us look at the most basic service, right? If the account balance service is not the one requested, then it will go down to see if it is get general help information, right? If that is the case, again, it validates the basic protocol, then it goes in to call the main.xaml entry point of the banking application. Now, in this case, the process is slightly different. We do have the invoke help process, but this time we are calling the main entry point. And in this case, the process name is the actual name of the process that you see in your assistant, right? And that is the name of the process, right? And here again, you can see that it is listed as a configuration setting on line 2. And if I go to line 2, it is the name of the process, right? And then you pass in the object ID and the email instruction. And notice that there is no other information here. There is no entry point path because the main.xaml is by default the entry point that is called when you invoke a process. Therefore, you do not have to specify any entry point path here. And remember, the use package flag does not apply to a main.xaml entry point, and therefore there is not any informational comment that has been put in place here, right? Now, coming back to the email route process, in all cases, right, regardless of which service is invoked, each of these will return a common output. It's called out route status message, and the value of that message or the type of message that is contained will depend on which service has been invoked. And then the assign function here actually adds a little bit of information to it and composes that message completely. It says that the instructions that were sent have been received and verified and are in process, and we will respond to you shortly, right? Now, the last piece here is that the router must handle information or protocols that are not sent correctly, or that it is not designed to handle, right? In this case, it handles only 3 of them. Now, in case the validation fails or the protocol checks fail, all three of them fail, then here you see the route status message is empty and the process will throw an error, right? Throw invalid protocol error message. Now it throws this error here because that error is handled by the main flow, right? Any exception caught in the step is handled by the exception here. And then an email goes back to the client immediately, right? Saying, hey, whatever you sent, that protocol is invalid, right? We don't support that. Please correct the protocol and resend your request, right? So please do go through each of these piece by piece. And I hope that by the end of it, you'll get an idea of how this whole loosely coupled system works. So this brings us to the end of the walkthrough of the integration service router application. So once this is tested and you know it's working, you will deploy this to your orchestrator just like any other process, and it will be visible for you to look at in your assistant. Here it is, UI Bank Service Router, right? So you have the multi-service banking application and you have the service router. The one thing that remains is for you to now associate your UiPath Integration Service for Outlook 365 to the UI Bank Service Router. So the last time in part 2 video, when we created the online banking application, the integration service trigger was associated directly with that monolithic money transfer application, right? And here you can see how tight the coupling is, right? The integration service trigger drives the banking application directly. Now I have since disabled that trigger. It's no more active. What is active now is the integration service trigger that is tied to the UI Bank service router automation, not the banking application.